This is the good karma economy. And I think every conference should be incomplete without thinking a little bit about can you do good and actually make money in the process. And I think everyone in the morning, kind of said they do that, but I got people here on stage who as a career are social impact investors and philanthropists and are thinking actively about how to build a better India. So without ado, I'm going to, quickly tell you who each one is so that because Ranjana Khanna is the director of India's Impact Investors Council, which represents all social venture capitalists in the country. Debashish is the country manager for Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. On my left is Karthik Desai. He runs Asha Impact, a venture capital fund focused on the social sector. And Preeti Sinha is the president CEO of Yes Institute, a think tank at Yes Bank, again thinking about sustainability. So Debashish, let's get this going right away. And there are multiple social challenges, and I think a lot of the panels earlier, whether they spoke about education and healthcare and pollution and urban planning, I think some of that came out. But there are so many more that you get to tackle. And it is unclear to a lot of people, where does impact investing sit vis-a-vis all the other things that you do as philanthropy? And do you at Dell Foundation, have you thought through what problems are best solved with what kind of capital?
Thanks, Amit. It's a pleasure to be here. That's a great question. I think, Amit, the way we approach is first by asking what's the problem we are trying to solve. And whether it's in the areas of education, jobs, livelihoods, or financial inclusion, the three areas that the Dell Foundation is focused on, and try to understand what is the best model that can solve that problem. Based on the model, the decision about which investment tool, be it grant, be it equity, be it non-convertible debentures, or contracts with strategic consultants, is decided. So yes, if I sort of broadly explain that when it is about systemic change, it is about bringing about ecosystem platform development, those are best supported by grants because those don't normally have a revenue play, but extremely important both from a social development perspective and equally importantly, many of the for-profit ventures that get equity needs to have that sort of a platform to operate under. But that platform itself or the environment does not. And I'll give you some examples. But when we are looking at innovation, we're looking at disruptive innovations, say, for example, in education technology that can teach underprivileged children in a personalized manner. That sort of innovation is usually found in for-profit startups, entrepreneurs who are really speaking, developing and delivering those sort of innovation. Or if we are looking at saying, what's the most effective way of delivering MSME finance in India? That type of model is best coming out from the for-profit venture. So there, our play would be an equity and not a grant. If we are looking at something, even say, for example, we want to support for-profit ventures or social enterprises, but they are not in at a stage where more equity is the right answer because the equity might either over-dilute the promoter's ownership or for a variety of other reasons. We will then deploy non-convertible debentures for them, give them a long-term loan at subsidized rates sometimes or at market rates, whatever be it. Or when we are working with, say, large-scale systemic transformation, for example, we are involved with the states of Haryana and Rajasthan to drive school transformation projects in those states, we believe that type of a massive change agenda that changes all aspects of education in a state requires the best brains to work, not just not just whatever is available. So in those cases, Amit, we have even enlisted and paid for the services of consultants like a McKinsey or a Boston Consulting Group who are actually working with the Chief Minister's office in Haryana and Rajasthan to design and implement those projects. So I can elaborate further later, but to the point, I think impact investing to us is a very, very important tool, but it is one of the tools in the whole toolkit, depending on what type of change we are trying to bring and what is the business model that we want to support to achieve that.
Thanks, Debashish. And I think, just for this audience, every problem you heard about in India for the last day and a half, this group on the stage and others who are our partners, they're trying to solve this outside the government system and often with the government system. Just for you to get a bird's eye view, the total social sector investing in India is $120 billion. So not a lot for a country, but 90% of it comes from government. The fact that this other 10%, which private sector philanthropists, social impact investors are bringing, is now $12 billion and growing at 20%, is hope that all of you out here in the room as well are going to join in and try and solve these problems. And Karthik, you know, back to impact investing, the other tool, and as you describe what that is, I want to specifically ask you that we know that impact investing is growing at over 20% compounded annual growth rate. It's crossed $1 billion. Yeah. It is about as much as CSR now in the country. It is still less than what Indian philanthropists give, about 5 billion annually, or how international philanthropists give to India, about 5 billion. But $1 billion now is a big number. So tell everyone what is behind this growth, that it has grown from 400 million in 2013 to $1 billion in 2015.
Great, thanks Amit, and nice to be here. So just to answer that question and maybe trace the journey of the impact investing sector, I'll just briefly talk about my journey. I first got introduced to impact investing around 2000 in the US at an organization called the Rockefeller Foundation, which coined this word, impact investing, and moved back to India in 2005 when there were about 4 or 5 funds active in India, including the Dell Foundation, a fund called Avishkar, Low Capital, and a few others. So that time, it was very much a new thing. And as you said, over the last maybe 7, 8 years, the sector has grown dramatically. And now there's about $1 billion of capital, coming into the sector every year. Why is that? Right? That's your question. I think partly it has to just do with the market, right? There's so much happening here. So the typical sectors that impact investors look at are what we call the need-based sectors, the larger, broader market beyond that top 1%. So what are the basic needs of any human being? Education, healthcare, food and agriculture, energy, and so on. So that's one, just the simple scale and the need. Second is, I think, the availability of capital. There's a lot of venture capital out there and people are constantly looking for those opportunities. So the availability of capital in general has increased. Typically, the impact investment sector has generated most of its capital from foreign development finance institutions. But that is again starting to change. And particularly with the growth of the microfinance sector. Over the last 7 or 8 years, people have seen this kind of this example of a successful, financial scale and returns that's actually come to bear. So that has again attracted more commercial capital, though we still have a long way to go. The third factor, I think, which is very important to understand, is simply, the fact that every problem in the world exists in India, but potentially also the solutions. In other words, we've got a massively strong entrepreneurial climate here in India. So you have a lot of dynamic entrepreneurs, good education system, relatively speaking, at least for elite people from the colleges and so on. So you have a lot of interesting business models and people trying to do stuff. So you have the capital and then you have the entrepreneurs. And finally, I think it should also be said that the role that the government has played, not just in providing an overall stable, governance and economic framework, but specific initiatives. Every major initiative, if I can put it this way, that the government has taken in the last 3 or 4 years, those of us who work in the impact investment sector have been knowing about it, thinking about it for the last decade or so. Jan Dhan Yojana, right? That's part of financial inclusion. Digital India, Make in India, Swachh Bharat. So it's almost like every single sector that the impact investors talk about. So it's very closely aligned to the objectives of the government. The Prime Minister's, this Awas Yojana for housing and so on. So I think these are the factors: a massive market, availability of capital, the demonstration of some exits in some scale, awesome entrepreneurial climate, and alignment with government priorities. I think these are all the factors which have caused impact investment to really scale up as it has, and now it's kind of at an inflection point. There are some limitations in the model, and there's still a long way to go, but these are the sort of the supporting factors at least.
Thanks, and I think I must add, for those of you who, who've had a little bit more older view, a stereotype view of what our social sector is, it has dramatically professionalized. Even when I was back in, school and college, there were half a dozen institutes which had a master's in social work. People coming out of those were called Jholawalas who are going to go run some NGOs in nondescript places. But I think just look at these people on the stage here and people outside this room who are bringing that 12 billion and trying to put all their expertise and managerial know-how to solve these problems with professionalism, and that's dramatically changed, and that's behind some of this growth. Preeti, let me come to you. You're from a mainstream banking background, and Yes Bank at that. What has bank got to do with social impact investing?
Okay, great, thanks Amit. So just to give a context, I've been in the development finance world globally for the past 20 years, and last 6 years at the African Development Bank. So the point is, having seen the aid world, which was typically the traditional donor, a Norwegian fund, helping healthcare, the main argument is private capital, mainstream private capital has to be involved in a country's development. Other than that, the whole ecosystem of the country will not change. So that's the rationale for coming back here at Yes Bank as a private sector mainstream capital provider to set up a think tank. So we've set up a practicing think tank called Yes Institute. And our main mission is getting private capital into development. So one aspect, what I think about ourselves is as a development investment bank. You see, an investment bank's defined as somebody who knows the market very well. Our strength comes from knowing all the funders and all the projects, all right? So we try to play a connecting role, connecting capital. So that's a role that we feel that somebody like a large bank infrastructure can play, and we bring more of the mainstream guys onto the table because we bank them. And the other aspect we want to do is, again, bring innovative financial instruments to the table. So while the funds are such a valuable tool and we are fully supportive and very happy to partner, we think things like social impact bonds, which we are trying to do another one now in South India with an educational institution, or crowdfunding. We're doing crowdfunding as a platform for something on culture, actually, in Middle India. And maybe lastly, like a green bond. We issued green bonds, so it was a private sector issuing bonds which the public sector bought. So the multilaterals bought these bonds. So it's just trying to increase the pool of capital that does development. That's the main argument.
Thanks. And I am quite hopeful that in our lifetimes, the social economy is going to dramatically grow and it's going to replicate, the complex network that we have in the mainstream capitalist economy. And Ranjana, let me come to you because you have brought together all the social impact investors under one platform called IIC. So as an ecosystem player, what is it that you are seeing that everyone in this room should be hopeful about? Because everyone who drives through India knows all our problems. What specific changes have you seen that we should derive hope from?
Thanks, Amit. See, we at IIC, strongly believe that the impact investing community will largely contribute to the India growth story by, investing into the grassroots levels and creating jobs at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, if you see in the past few years, we've been seeing a lot of positive changes and which are all aimed towards the underserved in the country. Let's look at some of these. Like the priority sector guidelines from Reserve Bank of India, for example, which certainly directs the bank financing towards the bottom layer. And not only that, I think the recent changes to the priority sector lending, like, inclusion of social infrastructure and renewable energy, and, inclusion of medium enterprises in that. So that will certainly open a lot of opportunities for the banks to also, viably invest in these sectors, and it will certainly see a benefiting, in areas of social infrastructure, like, creation of more and more schools and healthcare and, creation of sanitation facilities. So that is one. And if you look at, on the funding side, the alternative investment funds structure, which includes social venture funds. Now, these were largely created to pool Indian and foreign capital, for investing in India towards predefined social impact goals. Now, from 2015, with the tax pass-through happening for the category 1 and 2 AIFs, we see, this will certainly give a lot of fillip to the entire industry. And why forget, the India Aspiration Fund by the Small Industries Development Bank of India. This is a fund of funds, and this will aim at, investing towards venture capital funds, which are supporting equity, providing equity support to small enterprises, and especially at the startup level. So we see a lot of capital going, we will see a lot of capital going towards the bottom rung and, benefiting in areas like sanitation, education, nutrition, which are the dire need for our country at this point in time. So we clearly see that the policy environment currently is getting more and more conducive for the social entrepreneur. And that is where our role as IISc becomes important, because IISc is committed to, align the policy changes further for the benefit of impact investing and impact investment in India. And some of the areas where we think we would like to focus going forward in future is, one, making India ready for more innovative products like, like Preeti was talking about, social impact bonds, development impact bonds, which will bring in more accountability for the social financing. And, second could be, creating more and more opportunities for the social enterprises to access ECBs, so that their debt costs could come down. And I think lastly, by, creation of institutions like Big Society Capital, like in US, UK, wherein, they're able to mobilize the dormant funds lying within the banking system and, in dormant accounts towards social financing. So these could be some of the areas I think we are able to do something. I think it will be a huge fillip to the entire impact investing industry. And we are very positive about that.
Thanks, Rachna. And this might surprise you all to know that despite this $12 billion coming from the private sector, it's highly skewed. Most of the issues that you read about in the newspapers every day get no funding at all. Gender issues, next to nothing. Disabilities, next to nothing. Climate change infrastructure beyond solar power generation, next to nothing. Let me tell you where the skew is. In social impact investing, almost 94% go to just two sectors, which is financial inclusion, microfinance, and clean energy. On philanthropy side, 90% plus goes to just four sectors: education, healthcare, disaster relief, which tends to have big skews, and rural development. And Debashish, given this skew, there's so many issues that we read about and get outraged when we read about in the press. What are you thinking about? How are you thinking about the diversity of our expenditure, of fundraising, and focus on these other sectors?
That's a great question, Amit. We see that. If I were to just look at the about 30-odd impact investment companies in our portfolio, the ones that are most sort of, I would say, easiest to attract investment from co-investors and others are in the financial inclusion side. Whereas areas like education or jobs and livelihoods is much tougher. The reason being that the impact investment sort of investors are mostly looking at financial returns. They, of course, have a social agenda, but the financial return is a very important part. But the other areas, whether it's an education or skills, livelihoods, they're passing through a phase which require capital of a very different nature. Capital that is very patient, capital that is of a much higher risk appetite. So that's the reason a philanthropic organization like us can take that risk before proving that it is safe or it is, it's sort of at a stage where it can, attract a lot of private capital. So I think that's the reason we believe that there is a very important role for philanthropic capital to come in and invest and grow and demonstrate models in the areas that you highlighted. And in our portfolio, I will say for example, education, which is much more difficult from a business model perspective to create viable business models. Whereas if you look at an MSME finance, it is very difficult, but still there is a line of sight to financial viability. So different capital needs to play different roles to do that. It reminds me of the time when we had started investing in microfinance, urban microfinance about 10 years back. Urban microfinance, as you know, has been there for a very, very long time. But there was no urban microfinance existing because it was considered urban microfinance is not going to work because the model that worked in the self-help groups, et cetera, in the rural areas is not going to work in the urban space. That requires, first of all, some very visionary leaders like Ramesh Ramanathan, who set up Janalakshmi, or Samit Ghosh, who set up Ujjivan. But let me tell you, when they first set that up, there wasn't much interest. If you fast forward the tape today, they're some of the rock stars of the financial inclusion space. But it required at that time people like us to say, yes, it's not proven, but we see if it is proven and if it is really made to work, it can have a disproportionate impact on the bottom of the pyramid. So, Amit, I think that's where the importance of various different types of capital comes in. And we, for one, do not believe it is an either-or story. It is an and. We need to. And particularly, I will appeal to all the thought leaders, influencers in this room. Please step forward and do whichever part of that capital deployment fits your strategy. Wherever you think you can play, come forward because there is a need for every type of capital. It depends on which stage, which risk appetite you want to play in.
Yeah, no, thanks, Debashish. And another interesting factoid, I know we were celebrating Uber's success a little bit earlier, and I'm a big fan of the internet economy. But that's going to come at the cost of people being denied labor rights. Okay, so one of the big things philanthropy addresses is just human rights. And the last bill UPA 2 passed on the last day of the functioning of the parliament, just after Telangana was given statehood, was for the rights of street vendors. Okay, and for 60, 70 years now, India has had, several movements trying to get the porter at the railway station, the loader offloaders in, vegetable markets, the labor rights, because they don't have those rights as they are not employed by anyone, they cannot be unionized. And when we celebrate those successes, someone's going to leave a trail behind which philanthropy and social impact investors later on have to come in and solve. And I think there'll be costs of those success. And that's where I want to come to you, Preeti, and a little bit from the banking side itself. One of the things these guys have been successful in is creating competition for you through small finance banks. All the microfinance success led to a whole bunch of people who now have SFB licenses, and they're going to do all the stuff commercial banks are going to do. As you look into the future, what do you think will happen? Will serving the poor and the poorer states in India be left to all this tier 2 of the banking system called small finance banks? Or will the commercial banks continue to step up, priority sector lending will continue to grow, all of that would happen? How will this play off in the banking system?
So Amit, I had a couple of main points to make on this. So one reason why we are all in this space is to create a more equitable economy, right? So you can't have an economy that's got a very high income tier running away and another tier that needs to catch up. So the idea is that we should have an equitable growth where everybody has a basic standard of living. At least that's my mission. And why? Because sooner or later, these factors of infrastructure and social sector will impact everybody. So as citizens of a country, it's our right and duty to make sure we have a more equitable society. So for instance, the air pollution levels, etc. I mean, it's not an idea for one part of the society. So my focus is that in India's development, infrastructure and social sectors are two big aspects. And the aspect of the small finance banks addresses, I think, is access to capital. So as a more mainstream bank, we are very happy for more small finance banks, other banks to come up because I think everybody should have access to capital. So I think that's the role that they play. And the role that we are trying to play is how to, enable the large infrastructure projects, the large social sector revolutions, and how do you get something like MSME banking, to a level that it becomes very mainstream. So, as I mentioned, within the think tank, our focus is very much on the core innovative financial instruments, but beyond that, as part of the knowledge economy in the bank, we do the big banking for renewables. So just saying that, we're the #1 bank for renewables, where you need access to global capital markets. And that's the role we are trying to play. For instance, just to give an example, when you said renewables, IFC launched a bond, IFC, the World Bank, on the London Stock Exchange, a green masala bond, and use those proceeds to invest in Yes Bank's bond, which is on green, and then we invest that in green projects. So I think there's a role for both parties to play, and I'm totally positive for any access to capital, which I think the new ecosystem provides.
Thank you, and today I'm just throwing some factoids, and I'm going to give the last question to you because Karthik is going to tell you it's very attractive to solve social problems. It's actually more profitable to solve social problems in India in the last 4 or 5 years than it is to put your money in venture capital or private equity. So I'm going to hold the best part of this for the last. And Ranjana, you get the second last question, which is just thinking about India's future with social impact investing. And we have that, McKinsey did this study where they say India is the largest market in the world in terms of receiving social impact investments. We got all the ingredients to build the next IT sector for India. So the social sector developed. We have the most poor. We have the most social problems. We also have the greatest amount of entrepreneurs who can solve the problems. So as you look into the future, what are the few things we should expect which IIC is going to put its weight behind that can help us actually show the world we are ground zero and we are solving problems not just for ourselves, but then can export these models to Africa or other parts of the world where they need to solve similar problems?
Thanks, Amit, and that's an excellent question. No doubt, I think the research numbers and we all witness that India is one of the biggest market for impact investing. We have a huge demand side because of our pressing social problems. And, in 2015 alone, we witnessed investing of around $1 billion within the impact investing space. And, if research numbers are to be believed, I think the world economy is growing in this sector by 20% every year. And at that rate, by 2025, we will witness something like a $6 to $8 billion getting absorbed in the industry, in terms of capital in the industry every year. So let's look at some of the things I think which we should look forward to. One, I think it's only a matter of time when social impact investing within the country, gets recognition, and the industry is certainly moving towards more and more unification, and they are, as more common standards and metrics for, measuring and reporting the impact. As they get developed, the industry is sure to get its due, respect and recognition. And with more and more standardization, I think we can expect more performance-linked products gaining popularity in the industry. Other thing could be, I think, which is the need of the hour, is encouragement to the retail investor to get involved in the impact investing. How do we do that? There could be many ways, like crowdfunding, or maybe creating certain appropriate structures for the retail investor to invest in social impact bonds or development impact bonds. Another trends which we could look up to is social stock exchanges. Like we have one in Singapore, Impact Investment Exchange, which markets and which does market assessment and, dealing in securities in the social sector. So that could provide a very good, access to funds for the entire industry. And that kind of model can be easily replicated to a market like India. So, let's look at some of the numbers on the social financing, like you were discussing, Amit, some time back. We have a social financing of around $120 billion in India, and large part of it is coming from government sources. But let's look at the other components like international philanthropy, domestic philanthropy, CSR initiatives of the corporate India, and impact investing. Now, even if we assume a very nominal growth rate, like a 6 to 7% across segments, this is an economy which is, which is growing, expected to grow to a size of 1 trillion USD by 2050. So this is the potential we are talking about. And one of our greatest challenge right now would be that, the industry probably does not have the appropriate capital across the risk return spectrum. So we have a lot of capital flowing in, but most of it, around 80 to 90%, is from foreign sources, and domestic capital has not been mobilized to that extent.
Thanks, Rajana. And I would hazard a guess that the $1 trillion mark for social economy might even happen sooner. I believe it might even happen in the next 10 to 15 years. So that's what we are creating. So Karthik, last question. How profitable is it to solve social problems?
Great. So I'll answer that first by prefacing this point that has been repeatedly raised about the spectrum of this risk return, right? Because one of the reasons that people get confused about impact investment, and Debashish put it very well, which is that you have philanthropic capital at one end, and at the other end you have purely risk-adjusted capital, commercial market rate of returns, 25% IRR, let's say, which is what private equity venture capital firms look for, and everything in between. So it depends on the scale and the stage of the enterprise. As an enterprise starts off to take a longer-term risk, you will need some sort of philanthropic capital. As the enterprise grows and scales and becomes more and more sustainable, you will start to see higher and higher returns. So that's the first point. We have to accept that, right? That there's different types of impact investors who will play at different parts of the spectrum, and those of you who are interested in coming into the space will also have to consider that. Second aspect one has to consider before I answer this returns question is the VC fund economics. Typically, how the venture capital industry works globally, it's if I can overly simplify it, is let's say I have $10 million, I'll make 10 investments of $1 million each. I expect 80 to 90% failure rate. So 1 or 2 will succeed. Therefore, on that one investment, I need a 10x, 8x kind of a return in order to get my 25% IRR. In India, in general, let alone for impact investment, that's not going to happen. A good investment will give you maybe 3x, 4x, a decent return. So therefore, you can't expect a 90% failure rate. You have to have a 50, 60% success rate. So completely different economics. And then there's the economics about the minimum fund size, right? To run a venture capital fund, you need a certain team, a certain capability. You have this 2 and 20 structure, which is whatever is your fund size. Let's say it's $100 million. So $2 million will be your fees for which you run a team. So therefore, what kind of ticket sizes can you deploy? So as a result, there's a severe challenge for capital at the early stage from domestic investors of a philanthropic type, and that's just a challenge which is there. For those companies which are able to attract that capital and scale up, there is a good availability of Series A capital. And if you look at the track record of the impact investment industry over the last decade or so, and this McKinsey report, which is going to be coming out soon, is going to mention this, I think on average the IRR has been about 15%, okay? Which is actually very, very healthy. That's typically what the stock market delivers in the long term, and that's higher than what most venture capital firms have developed. This is across the average at a portfolio, at a fund level. In terms of individual sectors and investments, it's significantly higher. So in microfinance, for example, or in SME finance, MSME finance, it can be in the order of much, much higher than that. So I think and maybe we can use that example to end this, as Mr. Mitter said. Companies like Jana Lakshmi, like Ujjivan, and even though I'm a fairly young guy, I was around 7, 8 years ago when some of these funds like MSDF and Low Capital and others gave them those initial grants and so on, right? And people used to consider it like a chota company and this kind of a thing, like a small niche activity. Not only are these guys small finance banks now, and by the way, of the 10 small finance bank licenses, 8 of them were erstwhile MFI companies. And it's not like the large corporate groups in India didn't apply for these licenses. So just think about that fact for a second, right? These companies have IPO'd, Ujjivan, SKS, and others. They're multi-billion-dollar companies. You talk about the so-called unicorns of India, right? These paper tigers. I think Uber is a great company. I use it as well. But seriously, I mean, these are all, this is paper wealth. And we keep talking about them as, as unicorns and all of this. These are actually companies with multi-billion-dollar valuations, 4,000, 5,000 crores of revenues, which 5, 6 years ago were like small, tiny little companies, which people say, oh, this is just a niche activity. Okay, so, a lot can happen. So I think that is just to give you a sense of the potential. And there was this great article in your story yesterday which said that, people talk about the arrogance of venture capitalists and the herd mentality and all of that they like to pump more money into winners, and they're simply not looking at this larger 700 million, people market. So I think if more and more venture capitalists, more and more funders start to look at this not as some niche activity, but as where there's a massive amount of opportunity, because if you solve these social problems, you're adding economic value to society. By definition, you're creating wealth, right? It's not rent-seeking behavior, you're actually creating wealth. So if you create a massive amount of wealth, if the pie gets bigger, then of course you'll do pretty well for yourself financially.
Thanks, Karthik. And as we end this panel, I think I just want to strike a note so that we all share this dream. Philanthropy was the only product not disrupted for 2,500 years of human civilization. We've disrupted everything, every institution, every product and service on this planet, except the idea of charity. We can trace it back to Vedic times, biblical times. Moses wrote about it. Only product which had not been reinvented. And social impact investing is that chance to reinvent it and profit from doing good. And I think if we can set up social exchanges, if we can take this revolution to retail, so next time you're celebrating your child's birthday or your anniversary, instead of saying, bete, go to temple, give 11 rupees there, you say, oh, let's buy a stock on this social exchange, your money will grow, and it'll solve some problem. It will be a different world. And the world is headed that way. $1.4 trillion in Australian pension funds now send annual statements to their shareholders saying your money earned 6.5%, but it helped do X cataract surgeries in India, it sent so many girls to school in Bangladesh, and it gave so many farmers these micro loans in East Africa. Now, when you start expecting even from your commercial fund that kind of do good sentiment, we're going to build a better world. So on that note, thank you all. Please give a big hand to my panel here, Ranjana, Debashish, Karthik, and Preeti. And thank you, One Globe, for this.